The morning flight from Dubai to London felt like any normal journey. The passengers were relaxed, the cabin lights were soft, and a peaceful silence filled the plane as it climbed smoothly through the clear sky. Among the passengers sat a quiet woman in the middle of the aircraft. Nobody paid special attention to her because she blended in like any other traveler. She kept her hood slightly lowered, her hands quietly folded, and her eyes focused on the clouds outside the window. There was nothing about her that suggested she carried a secret, or that she once held a name that could shake even the calmest. Pilot. To everyone around her, she was just another passenger on a long flight. Up in the cockpit, the captain and first officer were handling the aircraft with practiced ease. They had flown this route many times, and everything felt routine. The captain joked lightly with the crew earlier, saying it would be a smooth day in the sky. No one expected the calm to break. No one expected anything unusual to happen. It was just another day at 30,000 feet. Then, about 2 hours into the flight, something changed. A small tremor ran through the captain's hand as he reached for a switch. He tried to hide it from the first officer, but the tremor grew stronger. He blinked several times, trying to focus on the instruments in front of him. The colors on the screen seemed to blur. The numbers appeared to swim, and his breath became unsteady. The first officer asked if everything was fine. The captain forced a smile, nodding slowly, trying to convince himself that he could push through whatever was happening. But the feeling did not go away. It grew heavier, like a weight pressing against his chest. Within seconds, the captain leaned back in his seat, his eyes losing strength. The first officer repeated his question, with more urgency, but the captain could not answer. His head lowered, his hands slipped from the controls, and he slumped to one side. The first officer froze for half a second, shocked, not expecting anything like this. Then he reached over to try to support the captain while keeping the aircraft steady. The plane was still flying, but a sudden tension filled the cockpit. The captain was no longer able to help. Inside the cabin, the passengers felt nothing unusual yet. The quiet woman in the middle seat simply watched the clouds drifting below. She was calm, still, and completely unaware that the flight she boarded to stay invisible would soon pull her back into a world she had left behind. A world where people no longer used her real name. They only used her call sign, one she thought she would never hear again. The first officer called the lead flight attendant urgently. When she arrived at the cockpit door, she immediately saw the captain slumped and unresponsive. Her heart dropped. She had been flying with him for many years, and she had never seen him like this. She looked at the first officer, who whispered that he could handle the controls for now, but they needed help. They needed someone who could support the landing if the situation worsened. The lead attendant rushed into action, moving down the aisle with a voice that tried hard to stay calm. She announced that they needed any passenger with medical experience. Several people stood to help and moved quickly to the front to assist the captain. But even with medical attention, there was another truth the first officer kept to himself. The landing ahead was not simple. Weather near London was getting rough, and the captain's presence was crucial. The first officer could fly, but he needed support from someone who had deep experience in difficult conditions. Someone who knew how to stay calm under extreme pressure. Someone who understood the sky not just as a pilot, but as a fighter, someone with instincts that normal training could not teach. The lead attendant looked around the cabin again, her eyes moving from row to row, searching for anyone who might be able to help the first officer. That was when her eyes paused on the quiet woman sitting alone, eyes still distant, as if she were listening to something far away. There was something unusual about her calmness, something steady, something controlled. The attendant couldn't explain why, but something told her this passenger was not ordinary. She approached her gently and asked if she had any flying experience. The woman did not answer at first. She simply looked at the attendant, her expression unreadable. For a moment, The attendant felt unsure whether she had made the right decision by approaching her. Then the woman spoke very softly. She said she used to fly, but it had been a long time. The attendant felt hope rise. Without thinking, she asked her name. The woman paused again, as if deciding whether she should say it. Her real name didn't matter, not anymore. The sky had once given her another name. A name known to only a few. A name whispered by pilots who had flown beside her in dangerous missions. But she did not share that. Yet not here, not now, still. Something inside her shifted. She could sense the tension in the air. She could feel fear slowly creeping through the aircraft, even though the passengers did not know the full truth yet. And she knew this moment would not let her stay hidden much longer. The sky was calling her again, and soon, the entire crew would speak the name she tried so hard to forget: vampire. The quiet woman sat still for a moment after the lead attendant walked away, as if weighing a decision only she understood. Around her, passengers were beginning to sense that something was wrong. A few had whispered conversations. Others looked toward the front of the cabin, noticing the flight attendants moving faster than before. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that the captain was no longer able to fly. And no one knew that the flight was now depending on the very woman who had promised herself she would never step into a cockpit again. She took a slow breath and finally stood. Her movements were calm, almost gentle, but there was a heaviness. In her eyes, a look that only someone who had seen too much sky, too many close calls, would carry. As she walked up the aisle, people moved aside instinctively, sensing something strong in her presence, even without understanding what it was. Lead attendant met her halfway, relief washing over her face. She whispered quickly, explaining that the captain was still unresponsive and the first officer needed help. The woman nodded once, saying nothing more, but in that single gesture, there was a strange mixture of acceptance and regret. It was clear. She had not expected to be pulled back into this world, yet she also could not walk away from it. When she reached the cockpit door, she paused. Her hand hovered for a moment above the handle. It had been years since she had touched aircraft controls. Years since she had heard the voice of command in her own mind. Years since anyone had called her by the name the sky had given her. A name she once carried with pride, until the day she disappeared from radar by choice. She stepped inside. The cockpit was filled with tension. The first officer looked exhausted from trying to fly and assist the crew at the same time. His eyes widened when he saw her, unsure who she was or why the lead attendant had brought her. She moved to the side quietly, assessing everything. Flight path, the autopilot mode, the upcoming weather, the speed, the altitude. Her eyes scanned the screens with a familiarity she had not forgotten, no matter how much she wanted to. "Do you have flying experience?" the first officer asked. She answered with a calm voice, "Yes, enough to help you." He didn't argue. The situation was too serious, and there was something in her tone, steady, confident, composed, that told him she was someone he could trust, even if he didn't know her story. Medical staff inside the cockpit tried reviving the captain again. The first officer glanced at the woman and said quietly, "It's going to be a difficult landing. Weather is unstable, and the approach requires 2 strong pilots." He hesitated. "I don't know if you're trained for this level." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached forward and adjusted a control with a precision that made the first officer stop breathing for a moment. It was a small correction, barely noticeable, but it was the kind of correction only a high-level pilot, someone with combat instincts, would make without thinking. The first officer stared at her. "Who are you?" Her eyes stayed on the instruments. "Someone who used to fly." That answer only raised more questions, but he didn't have time to press further. The aircraft hit the first sign of turbulence, shaking slightly. A warning tone echoed softly. He looked at her again, searching for fear or hesitation in her expression, but she showed none. She stood there, calm, balanced, more focused than anyone he had ever seen. Meanwhile, outside the cockpit, news of the emergency began to spread through the cabin. Passengers looked tense as the flight attendants tried to keep everyone calm. Some people prayed softly, others held hands. Fear was rising quickly, but so was something else, a sense that someone had stepped forward to guide them. The quiet woman kept one hand on the back of the first officer's seat as the turbulence grew stronger. She did not flinch. Instead, a strange transformation began to show in her. Her breathing became deeper, her eyes sharpened, her posture straightened. It was as if she were slipping back into a version of herself she had locked away long ago. The first officer noticed it too. "I feel like I've seen you before," he said quietly. "Not your face, but your way of flying." The woman looked at him for the first time. Her eyes carried a shadow of the past, something unspoken but powerful. "You haven't," she replied, not directly. He didn't believe her, but another jolt of turbulence pulled his attention back to the controls. The plane dropped slightly, causing gasps from the cabin. The woman placed her hand lightly on a stabilizer switch. "You can compensate here," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. The correction worked instantly. The aircraft steadied. The first officer stared at her again, now with a different kind of understanding. She wasn't just a pilot. She was something more. Someone who had flown in situations most pilots would never face. Someone who had earned a call sign whispered in fear and respect. Someone the sky once knew as Vampire. But he still didn't know the truth. Not yet. All he knew was that this mysterious woman had just prevented the first sign of danger, and the crew outside, the ones who had sensed her strength even before she acted, were beginning to speak softly, trying to remember why the name Vampire felt familiar. The sky was changing. The passengers were anxious. The first officer was overwhelmed. And she, the woman who tried to disappear, was being pulled back into the role she never wanted to reclaim. She didn't say it out loud, but inside her heart, one truth echoed. This flight was no longer ordinary, and they were going to need Vampire before it was over. The cabin had changed. Even without knowing the full truth, people felt something was shifting. The quiet woman who had walked up the aisle only minutes ago had returned with a different energy. The flight attendants whispered to each other, exchanging looks that carried both hope and fear. They did not know her name, but they felt an unusual steadiness around her, something rare, something almost trained. Inside the cockpit, the first officer was balancing the controls as turbulence grew stronger. The clouds outside thickened, forming darker shapes ahead. The woman stood beside him, her eyes moving slowly across every instrument, every reading. She wasn't touching the controls yet, but her calm presence filled the space like a second steady hand. Then the radio crackled. "Flight 729. This is London approach. We are tracking increasing storm activity. Prepare for possible diversion." The first officer responded quickly, but his voice carried strain. He knew what diversion meant. Flying into more complex airspace, making decisions that normally required the captain's experience. The woman listened quietly. Her jaw tightened slightly, as if hearing something she had hoped to avoid. The medical team inside the cockpit stepped back and shook their heads softly. The captain still had not regained full consciousness. He was breathing but unresponsive. He wasn't coming back anytime soon. Maybe not at all before landing. The first officer felt a cold sweat on his palms. The weight of responsibility pressed into him. He glanced sideways toward the woman again. "You said you used to fly," he whispered. "How long ago?" She did not answer immediately. Her eyes were on the radar, watching the thickening storm pattern ahead. "Long enough," she said quietly. but the sky has a way of calling people back. He looked at her hand steady, still, without the slightest tremble. Something in him trusted her, even though he didn't know her true story. He didn't know how many times she had taken control of aircraft under far more dangerous conditions. He didn't know why pilots once spoke her call sign with both fear and admiration, but he felt it. Outside, lightning flashed in the far distance. Not close enough to be dangerous yet, but close enough to warn that the calm window was closing. The first officer took a deep breath. "If this gets worse, I may need backup." The woman finally turned to him. Not with pride, not with fear, just with a clear, steady understanding. "You will," she said softly, "and I won't let you face it alone." The words were simple, but they settled in the cockpit like a safety net. The first officer nodded, his shoulders easing slightly, as if he had received a quiet promise from someone who had held the sky together before. He adjusted the controls again. The plane dipped slightly, and a warning tone rang out, making him jolt. She reached forward instinctively, not grabbing the controls, but pointing. "There, trim it 2 degrees left. The wind is pulling harder than you think." He followed her guidance. The aircraft steadied once more. "You really do know what you're doing," he said, half in awe. She did not reply. Sometimes silence said more than words. Back in the cabin, the lead attendant tried to keep everyone calm. She had not revealed the full emergency, but people sensed the tension. She spoke in soft reassurance, moving row to row, reminding passengers that everything was under control. But deep down, she knew who they were depending on now. She whispered the call sign to another attendant, testing the sound of it. "Vampire." The young attendant frowned. "Where did you hear that name?" "I don't know," she whispered back. "But I feel like it belongs to her." They both looked toward the cockpit door. Inside, the storm continued to build. The first officer checked the latest weather update, and his face tightened. "Wind shear warnings, visibility dropping. Landing will be rough." The woman nodded slowly. "You need someone on the second controls, not just anyone. Someone who knows how to read the sky in motion, not just instruments." He hesitated. Before asking, Can you take the right seat?" Her eyes lowered for a moment. A long moment. She had promised herself she would never take that seat again. She had walked away from flying to protect herself from memories she never shared with anyone, not even the people who once flew beside her. The world believed she had vanished, and she preferred it that way. But now people needed her, not for war, not for missions, not for anything she feared returning to. They needed her to save innocent lives. She stepped forward, gently moving the captain's seat back to make space. She touched the armrest of the right seat as if touching an old memory. Then she sat down. Slowly. It felt strange, familiar, heavy, but right. The first officer exhaled in relief. "Thank you," he said quietly. She placed her hands near the controls, but did not touch them. "Not yet. When the time comes," she said, "I'll take over." "But not before." He nodded. Another jolt shook the aircraft. Passengers gasped. Lights flickered for a moment. The woman leaned closer to the windshield, eyes narrowing at the storm ahead. "This isn't just normal turbulence," she whispered. "The path is closing faster than expected." "How do you know?" the first officer asked. "Because I've flown through storms like this before," she answered. "The sky speaks differently when danger is close." Her voice carried an eerie certainty, a certainty only one kind of pilot possessed, the kind who once earned the name Vampire. And even though she had not said it aloud, the first officer was beginning to suspect it. The plane shook again. Harder this time. She tightened her seatbelt, looked straight ahead, and spoke quietly. "It's starting." The storm found them. Faster than anyone expected. The aircraft entered a wall of dark clouds where sunlight faded into gray shadows. The soft hum of the engines felt heavier now, as if the sky itself was testing the plane's strength. Every person on board could feel the difference. Even those who knew nothing about flying sensed they had crossed into something dangerous. Inside the cockpit, the woman sat in the right seat, her expression focused but calm. Her breathing remained steady, even as the aircraft shook around her. The first officer kept his hands tight on the controls, trying to follow the instruments and the radar at the same time. He could feel the weight of every decision pressing into him. The woman watched quietly, not interfering, but her presence guided him like a silent compass. A sudden drop hit the aircraft, not a small shake, an actual drop, sharp and unexpected. Gasps erupted from the cabin. Luggage rattled overhead. The cabin lights flickered again. The first officer gripped the controls harder. "Wind shear," he muttered. "It's pushing us off the path." The woman leaned slightly forward. "Stay ahead of it. Don't wait for the next hit. Anticipate." He tried, but the storm was unpredictable, shifting from one direction to another. It felt like the sky was pulling the plane into a battle it wasn't ready for. Another warning tone rang out, making him jump. He glanced at her again. "How are you so calm?" She didn't look at him. "Because panic makes the sky smaller. Focus makes it wider. And right now, we need all the sky we can get." He didn't understand the meaning fully, but her voice carried an authority that steadied him. He took a breath, letting her words settle inside him. The radio crackled again. "Flight 729, do you copy? Weather is worsening. Expect severe turbulence." The first officer responded, but the connection weakened as static filled the speakers. The woman's eyes scanned the horizon beyond the windshield, though all she saw was gray. "We're losing radio clarity," he said. "Yes," she replied softly. "Storm density is high, but it's not impossible to fly through." "How do you know?" he asked again. She hesitated, the longest hesitation she'd had so far. "Because I've flown through worse," she finally said. He looked at her more closely. Her voice wasn't confident in a bold way. It was confident in a way that came from experience. Deep, heavy experience. Something inside him clicked. He didn't voice his thought yet, but it whispered in the back of his mind. She is not a normal pilot. She is something else. But the storm didn't give him time to ask. The aircraft twisted slightly, caught by a strong gust. He struggled to stabilize it, but the storm pushed back harder. "Let me," she said quietly. He released the control column just enough for her to take hold, not fully, but shared. Her hands were steady, smooth, unshaken. The plane responded instantly, leveling just enough to give them control again. "How did you do that?" he whispered. "It's all about pressure and timing," she said. "The air tells you what it wants, you just have to listen." He stared at her again. The way she flew wasn't standard. It wasn't learned from commercial training. It was something sharper, more instinctive, born from flying at the edge of possibility. "Who are you?" he finally asked. She didn't answer. "Not yet." Back in the cabin, the lead attendant tried her best to calm passengers. Fear was spreading quickly. Mothers held their children closer. Elderly passengers prayed softly. A young couple leaned against each other with closed eyes, trying to steady their breathing. Everyone sensed they were in a situation far beyond normal turbulence. One attendant whispered to another, "She's helping them, isn't she? The quiet woman?" "Yes," the lead attendant replied. "But I feel like she's more than what she says." "What do you think she is?" The lead attendant hesitated. "I don't know," she whispered. "But the name vampire keeps coming to my mind." The younger attendant shivered. "That call sign, I heard it once. On a news documentary. It belonged to a pilot who disappeared years ago." The lead attendant stopped walking for a moment, her face going pale. "You think it's her?" "I'm not sure," the younger attendant replied. "But if it is, we are safer than we think." Inside the cockpit, The aircraft hit another violent shake. The woman tightened her grip slightly, eyes focused forward like she could see through the gray. "We need to break through this layer before it thickens further," she said calmly. The first officer nodded. "What's your plan?" "We angle above the shear line," she said. "Just a few degrees. It will reduce the cross push." He checked the readings. "That could work, but it's risky." "All good decisions feel risky at first," she replied. Her voice held a kind of quiet wisdom that made him believe her without question. Together, they adjusted the controls, moving the plane upward into a smoother pocket of air. The shaking eased, not fully, but enough for the passengers to breathe again. The first officer exhaled. "You saved us again." "No," she said softly. "I just guided us through what the sky offered." He turned to her once more. "You're more than a pilot, aren't you?" Her eyes lowered. Something inside her shifted, as if an old memory tugged at her. She took a quiet breath, and for the first time since boarding the flight, she gave him a piece of the truth. "They used to call me something," she said. "What?" he asked. She looked straight ahead, her voice barely above a whisper. "A name I walked away from." He swallowed. "What name?" She paused. Then, with a calm that sent a chill through the air, she said, "Vampire." The cockpit fell silent after she spoke. Her call sign. The storm outside still pushed against the aircraft, but inside, everything felt strangely still. The first officer stared at her, unable to speak. He had heard that name before, not in casual conversations, not in training, but in stories pilots whispered when they thought no one was listening. Stories about a pilot who could read the sky like a language. A pilot who made impossible flights look effortless. A pilot who vanished without warning and without explanation. Many believed she had not survived whatever final mission she flew. Others believed she simply disappeared to escape the weight she had carried. No one ever imagined she would be found here, in a normal passenger seat, far from the world that once depended on her. But she was here. And her calm voice had confirmed what the sky already knew. The first officer swallowed hard. "You're that vampire?" She kept her eyes on the windshield. "Names don't matter anymore. I left that life behind." "But why?" he asked softly. Her hands tightened slightly around the controls, not in fear, but in memory. "There comes a time," she said, "when even the strongest pilots need space to breathe. I flew too long in places where survival was a question every second. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I needed to." He understood more than she expected. Many pilots carried weight the world never saw. But hers sounded heavier than most. Before he could ask anything else, the aircraft shook again hard. A loud thud echoed through the cabin as the plane entered a stronger part of the storm. Warning lights flashed across the panels. The radar screen filled with dense, shifting colors. The first officer grabbed the controls again. "We're in the worst part." She nodded once. "Then we get through it, step by step." Passengers gasped as the plane dipped sharply. And overhead, bin rattled and a few loose items slid across the floor. The lead attendant steadied herself on a seat, whispering a quiet prayer under her breath. She didn't know what was happening in the cockpit, but she trusted the woman now. Somehow she felt safer knowing Vampire was flying inside the cockpit. The storm hit them from different angles, each gust stronger than the last. The plane wasn't falling, but it was fighting to stay on its path. Wind pushing. "From the right," the first officer said. "Counterbalance with left trim." 2 clicks, she answered. He adjusted. The plane steadied again. He looked at her amazed. "How do you see it before it hits?" She exhaled slowly. "It's not seeing, it's feeling. Every aircraft has a heartbeat. When you listen closely, it tells you what the sky intends." He had never heard anyone describe flying like that, not even the captains he admired most. The radio crackled again, this time with faint voices. Flight 729, if you hear this, divert south. Repeat, divert. Static swallowed the rest. The first officer tried to regain the signal, but nothing came back except broken tones. The storm was blocking communication completely now. They were flying almost blind-only instruments, and instinct guiding the way. She reached out and adjusted the altitude knob by a small amount. Why lower altitude? He asked. Because this layer is too unstable, she said. We need smoother air below before the storm gets thicker. He checked the readings. That's a narrow pocket. If we misjudge by even a little, we won't misjudge. Her voice cut through the storm with quiet certainty. The first officer didn't argue. He didn't need to. He trusted her now. In a way he couldn't explain. She wasn't just flying, she was guiding the sky itself. They descended slowly. The turbulence continued, but less violently. The clouds around them shifted, opening small windows of lighter gray. It wasn't safe, not yet, but it was better. In the cabin, passengers felt the change. The shaking eased. A few people lifted their heads, some unclenched their hands. A small ripple of relief moved through the plane, but the lead attendant knew it wasn't over. She walked carefully to the cockpit door and knocked lightly. The first officer opened it just a bit. Is everything okay? She whispered. He looked at the woman beside him, who was adjusting the controls with calm precision. I'm not sure, he admitted. But she is. The attendant leaned forward and saw the woman for the first time in the right seat. Her eyes widened. You're flying? She whispered. For now, the woman replied gently. Who are you? The attendant asked. The woman hesitated, then answered simply. Someone who couldn't stay seated when people needed help. The attendant nodded slowly, deeply moved, as if she had just witnessed something rare. She closed the door softly. Inside the cockpit, the storm began to shift again. New patterns formed on the radar. The woman leaned forward. We're approaching the final band of turbulence. Once we cross it, the path becomes clearer. The first officer felt a flicker of hope. We're almost through? She nodded. Almost. But her eyes narrowed slightly, seeing something the radar hadn't shown yet, something forming ahead in the thick wall of clouds. The first officer noticed her expression. What is it? Her voice lowered, steady but cautious. There's a pocket ahead, too still. Still is good, he said. She shook her head. Not in storms. Still means something is hiding. A quiet tension filled the cockpit. The storm wasn't done with them, and neither was the sky. Asterisk. The pocket of still air ahead grew larger on the radar, and the woman's eyes followed it with deep concern. The sky looked calmer there, almost peaceful. But she knew peace inside a storm was never a gift. It was a warning. A quiet place meant a sudden shift was waiting on the other side. Something powerful enough to break stability in a single moment. The first officer glanced at her again. You're worried. Not worried, she replied. Alert. What do you think it is? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned closer to the windshield, as if the clouds carried a message only she could read. Storms hide their worst parts behind silence, she finally said. We go in prepared. The first officer tightened his grip on the controls, following her instructions carefully. They moved toward the still pocket slowly, the plane trembling less as they entered. For a few seconds, everything felt surprisingly calm. The passengers in the cabin whispered to each other, confused by the sudden gentleness of the flight. Some thought the worst was over, but the woman in the cockpit knew better. She listened, not to voices, not to radar tones, but to the aircraft itself. Every aircraft had a pulse, and right now, this one felt uncertain, like it was waiting for the next command. She reached forward and adjusted the stabilizers gently. The first officer watched her. You're preparing for a hit. Yes. What kind? She breathed slowly. A wind burst. Maybe two. The sky pulls back before it. Pushes hard. He had never heard someone explain storms this way, but the more she spoke, the more her words made sense. She didn't just fly through weather. She understood it as if she had lived inside it for years. The stillness deepened. The radar almost flattened. The engines hummed without struggle. Too quiet, too perfect. Then the hit came. A massive vertical gust slammed into the aircraft from below, pushing it upward so fast that several passengers cried out. The floor seemed to lift under their feet. Overhead bins shook violently. A few oxygen masks swung loose from their compartments. The first officer panicked for a moment, his hand slipping on the control column, but her hand steady, firm pressed. Over his just enough to guide him. Hold level. Don't fight it. Let it pass through us, she said. Her voice was soft but commanding, like someone who had guided pilots through storms far worse than this. He followed her lead. Slowly, carefully, the plane stabilized again, though the wind wasn't finished. A second burst came from the side, forcing the aircraft into a sharp tilt. Passengers gripped their armrests, some crying quietly, some whispering prayers. The lead attendant struggled to stay balanced as she helped an elderly woman back into her seat. Inside the cockpit, the woman countered the tilt with practiced ease, adjusting forces the first officer had not even noticed yet. You're reading. If faster than the instruments, he said, nearly breathless. I have to, she replied. In storms like this, instinct is faster than screens. He looked at her with a mixture of respect and awe. This is why they called you vampire. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply kept her eyes on the sky, face calm, even. As her heart carried weight she never spoke about, another jolt shook the plane, weaker this time but still sharp. She exhaled deeply. That was the last push, she said. Now the storm will thin. He checked the radar. She was right again. The screen finally showed lighter layers ahead, small patches of open sky breaking through. We're getting out of it, he whispered. We are, she said softly. The cabin felt it too. The shaking lessened, the pressure eased, and the passengers slowly unclenched their hands. Some began to cry out of relief. Others laughed nervously. The lead attendant placed a hand on her chest, breathing deeper and slower. She glanced toward the cockpit and whispered to herself, Thank you, whoever you are. But inside the cockpit, a new challenge was forming. The first officer looked at the fuel readings, and his eyes widened. We burned more fuel than expected. She checked the numbers. She didn't panic, but the seriousness of her expression deepened. How far to London? She asked. Farther than our current range, he admitted. And with the captain. Unconscious, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Landing would require precision, extra hands, extra skill. And they had lost time fighting the storm. He looked at her again. Can you land it? She leaned back slightly, her eyes soft but honest. I can, but it won't be easy. This aircraft is heavier than what I used to fly. But your instincts need support, she said gently. Landing is not about bravery. It's about balance. The first officer nodded slowly. He trusted her more than he trusted any number on the screen. Outside, the clouds finally parted, revealing a pale stretch of open sky, a fragile window of calm after the storm's violence. Passengers felt relief wash over them like warm air. The cabin lights stabilized. The shaking almost disappeared, but the woman wasn't relaxed. She knew the storm had taken something from them: time, altitude, fuel, and the captain who should have been guiding the plane home. Now she was in the right seat again. Now the sky was asking her to return fully, not halfway. Not temporarily, fully. The first officer adjusted the radio again, trying to reach London control. We need a landing plan, he said. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to a part. Of herself she had tried to silence for years. Then she opened them, focused. Steady, ready. Contact them, she said quietly. When they answer, she added, tell them Vampire is flying. Asterisk, the radio crackled faintly as the first officer tried again to reach London Control. Static filled the cockpit, then a thin voice finally pushed through. Flight 729, we see your signal. Heavy weather reported. State your status. The first officer looked at the woman sitting in the right seat. She gave a small nod, not encouraging him, not pushing him, just reminding him that he didn't have to face this alone. He pressed the radio button. London Control, Flight 729. Captain unconscious. Severe storm damage. Low fuel. Request. Emergency landing. A long pause followed. Then the controller asked gently, who is flying your aircraft? The first officer looked at her again. She didn't change expression, but something shifted inside her eyes, a soft acceptance. Quiet return, he answered slowly. Our second pilot is a former operative. She will assist. Name? The controller asked. The woman inhaled calmly, her fingers lightly resting on the controls. The first officer spoke before she could stop him. Her call sign is Vampire. There was a sudden silence on the radio. No static, no instructions. Just silence. As if the entire airspace had paused at the sound of that name. Then, quietly but with unmistakable recognition, the controller responded. Understood. Vampire, welcome back. Those words hit the woman in a place she thought she had closed forever. She did not smile, but her eyes softened, carrying both pain and strength. The sky had spoken her name again, and this time she wasn't. Running from it. London Control continued. We are clearing a priority path. All other aircraft are holding. You have the sky. The woman nodded, even though they couldn't see her. Copy. She took the controls gently. Not gripping, guiding. The plane responded instantly, like it somehow remembered her touch, even if years had passed since she last flew. The first officer watched her with growing awe. You make it look easy, he whispered. It's never easy, she replied. But it becomes possible when you stop fighting the sky and start moving with it. Below them, the dense clouds slowly opened, revealing the faint outline of the runway far ahead, barely visible through the mist. She adjusted their descent, checking the altitude and engine response. The first officer prepared the landing gear, glancing at her for confirmation. She nodded, gear down. The thud beneath them signaled the gear lowering into place. The passengers heard it too, and a ripple of quiet relief spread through the cabin. Some cried softly. Others held hands tighter. The lead attendant whispered, whoever. She's bringing us home. Inside the cockpit, the first officer monitored the indicators. Winds are shifting. Tailwind increasing. The woman narrowed her eyes slightly. We'll counter it. You sure? He asked. Yes, she said. But we need trust. The plane feels our hesitation, he nodded. I trust you. Her voice softened. Then the plane will too. They descended lower. The runway lights flickered through the fog like tiny stars guiding them home. But the final wind burst. The last breath of the storm hit them hard on the left side. The aircraft tilted. A few passengers screamed. The cabin shook. The plane dipped dangerously off alignment. The first officer reacted quickly, but his correction wasn't enough. The wind pushed fiercely, trying to drag them into a drift. She placed her hand over his again. Steady and calm. Together, she said. He steadied his breath. They adjusted in perfect sync, his strength, her precision. The aircraft slowly aligned. Again, the runway growing larger, clearer. Vampire, winds dying down. You're cleared to land, London Control said. She didn't reply with words. Her answer was the subtle, perfect angle she chose as the wheels approached the ground. The plane floated just above the runway for a second, one long, fragile second, and then touched down smoothly, a soft bump, a long roll. A final deceleration. Silence. Then the entire cabin erupted into applause, relief, and tears. Strangers hugged. Children laughed through their tears. The lead attendant leaned against a seat, crying quietly as she whispered, "She did it. She really did it." In the cockpit, the first officer looked at her with deep respect. "You saved." Everyone. "No," she said softly, "we did." Medical staff rushed forward to take the captain out safely. Ground crew surrounded the aircraft. But the woman unbuckled her seatbelt quietly, not seeking attention, not waiting for praise. "Will you stay?" the first officer asked. She shook her head gently. "I wasn't meant to return to flying. The sky called me only for this moment." "But the world believes you're gone," he said. She paused, then answered, "Let it believe. Sometimes strength must stay unseen." She stood, walking toward the exit as passengers lined the aisle. Many looked at her with gratitude, even without knowing her name. Some reached out to touch her arm, whispering, "Thank you." She smiled softly, nodding, but said nothing. At the door, the lead attendant stopped her. "You saved us. You saved all of us. Please, who are you?" The woman looked at her, eyes warm and gentle. "No one special," she said. "Just someone who heard the sky ask for help." And before anyone else could speak, she stepped out onto the quiet runway. The mist wrapped around her like a soft curtain. One moment she was visible. The next, she disappeared into the morning haze, leaving behind only the name whispered in awe by those who would never forget her. Vampire.